Okay, man. How are you, Ken?
Hey, I'm doing good. I'm here.
You made it.
Yeah, my ISP fell over a few minutes before the talk was due to start. Bad day.
Okay, no problem. No problem. So your talk is amazing. I think that I'm not going to present you or something like that. I let you present yourself and the talk and everything. I really want to thank you very much for being here in Patagon Space in Ecopari. This is like our second year. We took a lot of effort to prepare all these talks here. So thank you so much for being here. Sorry for this swap of the talks. We saved you, and it was amazing. Well, Ken, this is your stage. Have fun, and okay, we are
Great stuff.
all
Thank you.
eyes and ears.
Good, good, good. So I've got a talk today that's based on about the last 3 years of research, where we've had the privilege of having access to a number of aeroplanes and being able to spend time doing security research. So let me share my slide deck and let's get started, shall we? It's one of the most fun things I've done for a very long time. But what I want to do is really look at what's the reality, what's the hype, what do we know? So hopefully you can see my slide deck there. Who are we? Well, first of all, I'm a pilot. I'm not a very good pilot though, but I have colleagues who are also pilots, some private pilots, some commercial pilots. So we have a current Boeing 747 pilot on our team. And that's been really helpful because it helps us understand how commercial aviation works, whereas my knowledge is mostly private aviation. We have a lot of people on the team. We spend a lot of time working on planes. That's us on the right in the 747. We'll talk about that in a minute. Uh, One really important point from me is that we have to be super responsible, even more responsible than any other industry, perhaps outside healthcare, because disclosure in aviation is complicated and difficult. And one of the challenges about that is the media doesn't really understand the separate domains on board an aircraft. It's going to take a long time to get vulnerabilities fixed because aircraft are certified. You can't just apply a patch, it has to go through testing, it has to be approved, it has to be rolled out through a complex ecosystem. You can't hack the plane from the in-flight entertainment system. It doesn't work like that. Domains, so the primary domain, the one that's most interesting to us is the aircraft control domain. That's the bit that has all the controls, the uppy, downy, lefty, righty, engines and things. You have the AISD, which is for cabin crew particularly, which contains communication protocols for passenger systems. And then you have the bit that we've all experienced, so the passenger and information entertainment, so in-flight entertainment and services domain. That's where there's some fun stuff to be found as well. But these domains are separate. The ACD does not touch the AISD. There's also a lot of connections out there. So this is where things get quite interesting. A lot of data goes to and from airplanes now, and that started to expand the attack surface somewhat. So in the past, where you had to physically be in an airplane, there are an increasing number of vectors to remotely compromise an airplane, but there are many, many layers of security and defense in the way. Be very careful what anyone says about vulnerabilities in airplanes in the media. The media gets very excited, and there've been a lot of stories that did a lot of damage, not all of which were based upon fact. But what's changed? Well, all of a sudden, maybe a little bit of silver lining from the coronavirus pandemic is that a lot of older airplanes have been retired, and the breakers yards, the boneyards, are backed up. They have too much work on. So we had a really interesting opportunity to work with a breakers yard where they would bring a plane in and it would be sat there for months and months before they could get to parting it out and breaking it up. And we arranged to have access to these airplanes. We could power them up, we could light the engines, we could put ground power on, and we could do pen testing on real airplanes without any fear of causing problems for those airplanes in the future because they were going to be scrapped. Now, there are some big caveats. Bench power for avionics is dangerous. These things work at 400 volts, at very high amps. You run the risk of powering these things and blowing yourself up. You can throw yourself across the room. Some older components use CRTs with large power capacitors inside them. Make sure you've discharged everything before you touch anything and take good electrical safety precautions. You will find unusual protocols. So the most common protocol you'll find will be ARINC 329. Sorry, 429, which is a very old protocol. It's quite easy to work with. You can decode it using a picoscope, but decoding is one thing, injecting is another thing altogether. It's not easy. In the Boeing 777, you'll find ARINC 629, which is a different protocol, very hard and expensive to decode. But as we go towards the 787, the Boeing and sorry, various later Airbuses, you'll find in the Airbus A350, you'll find ARINC 664, which is an Ethernet-based protocol. Interesting, hey? What we're starting to find is components are becoming available, but they're all very old. So if you jump on eBay, you'll find some components being parted out, but they're all 10, 15, 20 years old. Anything that's still certified and flyable is expensive. But there's fun stuff to be done. So you can jump in the cockpit of an old plane, power it up, and start decoding traffic. And that's us working on an Airbus A320 a little while ago. Now, what goes wrong? Well, sometimes it's surprising things. So there's an operator in the USA, Raven Air. They were subject to a ransomware attack. It looks like their maintenance logs was encrypted and the backups. You cannot dispatch a plane into flight if you cannot prove it is airworthy, which is why your maintenance logs are really, really important. No maintenance log, because it's been ransomed, you don't fly. Sadly, that airline seems to have gone bankrupt in the last year, which is a real shame. Other crazy things you'll find. An electronic flight bag. They're increasingly being used to save paper. It's fundamentally a tablet, an iPad or an Android tablet. Electronic flight bag, used for lots of functions that I'll talk about in a lot more detail in a few minutes. But an EFB, application crashed. This is, I think, 2015. American Airlines lost access to their electronic flight bag apps with which you could not depart. You couldn't get the charts up to tell you how to take off and land. And as a result, the EFBs didn't work and thousands of flights did not go that day. It turned out to be a corruption issue to do with a duplicate chart for Washington National Ronald Reagan Airport. Another example, this is much more recent. This was last year. So Southwest, their weather app on the electronic flight bags failed. Not clear why, but the weather wasn't delivered and 1,415 flights did not move. They were all delayed. You cannot just go on Yahoo and get the weather for a flight. You have to have very specific types of weather for an aircraft to fly and land. Other crazy things. I'll go into this in a lot more detail in a few minutes. Other challenges around electronic flight bags include the calculations you do for takeoff and landing. You might not be aware that very few airplanes take off with full power for reasons of carbon dioxide saving, engine wear, and efficiency. You use a reduced power in almost all takeoffs. There are consequences because those calculations are done on the electronic flight bag. Fortunately, I believe there's only been one fatal accident. This was in 2004 from a 747-200 by MK Airlines, and through a miscalculation in the electronic calculations from the flight bag, the pilots didn't put on enough power. They were tired. They didn't recognize it. They went off the runway, and sadly, the airplane crashed and caught fire. More common, you see tail strikes happen where pilots make miscalculations. They over rotate because they haven't got enough power, and they trash the back of the plane. That can be very dangerous too as well. Other areas. Now, when you start getting access to planes, you're going to find lots of old stuff. You'll be very surprised how old some of the technologies are in there. But even so, you have to be careful. This is a retired 747 that we were working on. We had access to the in-flight entertainment system and flight attendants panel. So we were all over the AISD. Even so, even though this plane was retired, some of the systems it talked to were still live for other airplanes on the fleet. So be careful. Don't spook the media into publishing very scary stories that upset people. But to give you an example of how bad things can be, this is a 747 we were working on. It last flew in April 2020. We were working on it in June 2020. And on there, we found the AISD cabin management terminal. So that's the bit that the crew use for managing the in-flight entertainment system and all sorts of other things like meals and messaging to the ground, was running Windows NT Service Pack 4. Amazingly old. It was quite fun actually. Because I don't know about you, I've forgotten how to hack NT. So we actually had to go through a process of reminding ourselves and come up with a viable attack. It's on our blog. You can go and read the full story of how we did this successfully. But yeah, sometimes you find very, very old things. You'll also find floppy disks on planes from time to time. I've actually got with me, this is a navigational database from Boeing 747. That's in the cockpit. You'll find they're updated over floppy disk, which is kind of cool. You'll find PC cards in the avionics bays. The thing on the right there, that is a quick access recorder, uses a PC card. Fortunately, this one had an adapter to take it to CF, so compact flash. And from that, we could download and extract the quick access recorder data, which was all the faults on the plane and management logging. You'll also find some stuff you'll be familiar with. So you do find Ethernet, but typically not on the control domain. You'll tend to find Ethernet on the in-flight entertainment system and the similar. And you'll find crazy stuff. So that is the operating system disk. It's a solid state disk for a reasonably recent cabin management system. I need to go back and get an image of that disk before they take the plane apart. It'd be fun to see what's there. Where things get interesting is when we start to see passenger Wi-Fi. Some examples from the flight attendants panel here. The attendants panel is in the galley, in the accessible part of the cabin. Obviously, if you are messing around with this, I expect the crew to come and have a very stern word with you. And also bear in mind that other passengers are likely to take extreme exception to you interfering with anything in the airplane. So don't do this without permission, please. What we discovered, we could tamper with the Wi-Fi, we could get onto the backbone network for the in-flight entertainment system, and we could knock things out. Worst case, so the IFE stops working. People get annoyed because they can't see movies, but hey. Basic learning. We've reported these vulnerabilities. They've been fixed. One really fun one, though, at a 747 that was 23 years old. Its IFE had been updated. It was only about 3 or 4 years old. We discovered when it lands, it uploads the latest movies from an Amazon S3 bucket. When the weight goes onto the wheels of the undercarriage, it enables a wireless access point that connects to ground systems and pulls the media for the movies. We discovered that the S3 bucket was read write and, of course, managed to extract the credentials for that from the in-flight entertainment system. Actually, the vendor involved in this was extremely cool. They took our report very quickly, got the credentials changed, and changed the way that they authenticated to this system. It was great. Really, really cool vendor. Not like some vendors we've worked with in aviation. Also on the cabin management terminal, we discovered we could access a number of plain text protocols, and we could access the in-flight entertainment system and potentially push new media. So what would you do? Does it really matter? Maybe you could push some, I don't know, pornography, pretty unpleasant, make for a bad press story. Or perhaps more worrying is put up a video showing that the plane's been hijacked. That would really spook the passengers. Would it spook passengers into doing something dangerous? Perhaps. So that's the biggest worry to me. Typically, the uplinks for the passenger Wi-Fi's, whilst they're VSAT over the oceans, over the land, they're typically a downward-facing LTE or 4G downward link. We were looking at the router for it. We discovered credentials, and guess what? They're written on the door of the cupboard that the Wi-Fi router sat in. So that was pretty bad. Surely they can do better. In general, what do we find? Well, you find a lot of old systems on planes. You find very old protocols and components. You're going to find very old hardware, lots of exposed physical interfaces, but physical security controls do work. If you're messing around with systems on a plane that's being used, you're going to get arrested. If it's not the cabin crew that come and apprehend you, it's going to be another passenger. I'd be very upset if someone was trying to hack a plane. Our next step, one of the projects we want to look at, is actually getting the VSAT terminal adapter out of the overhead space in the 747. That's my colleague Dave, who's up in the passenger cabin in the roof. And up there on a tray is the terminal for the VSAT. No sign of any Ethernet. It's all ARINC 429, but we're going to get hold of that shortly and see what we can do in terms of hardware reverse engineering on the VSAT. That'll be really interesting. Now, I've talked about electronic flight bags. These are an area of extreme interest to me right now. What we discover is actually really weak standards for pilots using these devices. Many airlines actively encourage the pilots to use their EFB tablets as a personal device too. I'm not sure about that. We hear lots of stories about doing personal email, watching Netflix, browsing pornography, and other really unsavory things on a critical device that's really important. So there are two types of EFB broadly. There's a portable So that's one the pilot takes home, so an iPad or an Android tablet, and an installed EFB, which is physically bolted into the airplane. There are some halfway houses. So on the A350, there's a halfway that's kind of sort of installed, and there are some others as well. But our primary interest is in portable EFBs because they leave the aeroplane. Installed EFBs are protected behind the cockpit door, much, much harder to get access. So we spent time looking at performance calculators. And as I mentioned a moment ago, this is when you add power. It tells you how much power based upon your weight, the runway length, the wind, your engines, all sorts of things, temperatures. And that will then calculate how much power you need to apply on your engines to take off safely. There are multiple inputs, and the electronic flight bag does this and calculates it for you. Typically on Airbus, it's what's called a flex temp calculation. On Boeing's and others, it's called a D rate calculation. And your D rate on a 737 might range from about 57% up to about 90 something. It's very rare you use 100% power. Now, a lot of that data comes from an API, and a lot of those calculations are done locally on the device. We have found vulnerabilities in electronic flight bag apps that would allow one to tamper with the calculation data. You'd need a degree of privilege to the device, but you could compromise the way the calculations are made and the way that the data is handled. A lot of the data is stored locally, for example, runway lengths. If you could tamper with that, you can cause an incorrect D-rate or flex temp calculation to be performed. What the EFB does is it outputs power requirements and V speeds. Now, V1 is the speed at which the aeroplane can safely stop while still on the runway. VR is the rotation speed, so that's the one where you pull back the columns and the plane starts to rotate. V2 is the takeoff safety speed at which you can take off safely with only one engine. Now, the gap between V1 and V2, I can tell you as a pilot, is quite a scary place because you can't stop, but you can't take off. Anyway, incorrect V speeds can be produced, so the pilot rotates too early or too late. Too early, you create a tail strike. Too late, you run the risk of taking off too low and potentially infringing safety heights as you take off. On landing, if you can tamper with landing performance calculations, you run the risk of the pilot having the wrong braking settings and sliding off the end of the runway, or doing too much braking and you end up causing excess tire wear or potentially bursting a tire. We have found worse vulnerabilities on installed EFBs, but we accept that risks are mitigated because they're in the cockpit. We found trivially exploitable vulnerabilities. You could break out of these in the cockpit. They're also exposed ports. And the approach to security from many is to put a sticker over it saying don't use it, which isn't good. There are lots more things that an EFB does. They contain a lot of passenger information and lots more. I won't go into that, but there's lots more to be done, and there's lots more covered on our blog. One of the main problems I have is it's taking time for the aviation industry to catch up and truly understand cybersecurity. Security has been baked into aircraft design from a very early stage, but unfortunately, not all the aviation organizations have the same approaches to cybersecurity. We found 4 separate vulnerabilities in electronic flight bags. 3 of them have had variable responses to disclosure, including one who said that fixing the vulnerability would be a feature update. However, one vendor was amazing, took it very seriously, fixed it very quickly, and we think they're amazing. Very variable approach to security and integrating and interfacing with researchers. Sometimes we also see approaches to EFBs getting things wrong. A common lockdown for an iPad, for example, on the ground, a corporate device, is to use something like Face ID or similar. Yeah, if you get the lockdown wrong, you're going to cause safety problems. And a great example of this is using or mandating Face ID to unlock your iPad, because pilots like wearing mirrored sunglasses. They don't work very well for Face ID. We also have problems in an emergency situation. Your pilot may have been depressurizing. The pilot needs to put on an oxygen mask in order not to pass out so they can do an emergency descent. And Face ID doesn't work very well when you've got an oxygen mask on. That's really important because on that electronic flight bag is your emergency or electronic quick reference handbook. And that tells you how to deal with an incident. Typically, a depressurization and crash descent is done from memory, but you have to then cross-check using your EQRH. But you can't unlock it because you've got a face mask on. Great. So there's a lot of thought required, and we put a lot of good advice for airlines and operators thinking about how to lock down their EFBs safely. There's also big challenges around regulation. So we've advised various regulators about how they could improve cybersecurity, but there are differences between the European regulator, the FAA in the US, and the UK regulator, the CAA. There are differences in the way that regulation is done. Some are very prescriptive, some are not. Other stuff we do, we've done a lot of work on ACARS, which is the text-based over RF protocol that sends data to planes. TCAS, that's the collision avoidance system that stops planes crashing into each other in the sky, and lots of other stuff too. Some interesting research done by another organization looked at the potential of spoofing the instrument landing system. Now, we have an Airbus A320 simulator here, which we do a lot of replays and recreations of instance to see how they work. And a good example, this is taking the work that was done by others and showing the real impacts of this. You can see here the instrument landing system crosshairs are aligned on the left-hand display, on the primary flight display, or PFD. We look out of the window, we're in cloud, obviously. It's an instrument landing, so we can't see anything, but we're aligned on the approach. However, when we pop out of the cloud, you see the crosshairs are still centered, but actually we are about 400 meters to the west of San Francisco's runway 27 left. So actually, if we carried on to do a category 3 approach, which is where the plane auto lands, you run the risk of ditching in the ocean. Now, practically, this is difficult. There's a lot of RF power required, and it's more likely that what the pilot will see will be the navigation flags flip in and out as they get rogue signals. The pilot will then use other sources of information to land. TCAS spoofing is quite interesting. This is how you stop planes crashing into each other. Their transponders will interrogate each other, and if they detect a collision potential, they'll give each other avoiding actions, a resolution advisory, or RA. One plane will climb, the other plane will descend. However, some really cool research that was backed up by AVSEC Oxford, another aviation research group, showed that you could cause planes, particularly certain Airbuses, which will fly the resolution advisory under autopilot, to actually create uncommanded climbs and ascents, including up and down, which is really interesting. Again, technically challenging to reproduce because you've got to do it at altitude, which probably means you've got to be on board one of the planes with some large RF gear, but still interesting that there is potential to produce bogus alerts. My advice for everybody is be careful. Don't go hacking planes without explicit permission. There have been all sorts of cases where researchers have been playing with the in-flight entertainment system and going too far. That is illegal. Don't do it. Get permission. There are breakers yards around. If you're lucky, you find the right people at the right time. Maybe you have to pay a little bit of money. We usually have to pay for the jet fuel to power the airplane. It's not cheap. It costs us $400 to $500 an hour. Or we can get ground power a bit cheaper, but it costs money to do to power the systems up. Don't fall for media hype. The aircraft control domain is separate from the rest of the in-flight entertainment systems. You can't hack the plane from the cabin, certainly not in the way that's been described by some. There's also certification out there, so you can't expect an aviation manufacturer simply to patch a plane. It takes a lot of time to prove this. Buy your own kit. You can get it on eBay. It's old. And bear in mind that technical debt is a major problem too. But there's lots to do, and it's a really exciting place. And I would strongly recommend anyone get involved in the aviation village. The aerospace village at DEF CON is really cool. We'll be there this year with our simulators, demonstrating lots of cool stuff you can do, and lots of hardware we'll take as well. Lots more reading on our blog. That's a small section of it. And there's my details if you want to follow or ask some more questions offline, please. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening.
Ken, absolutely amazing. The talk was incredible. A lot of information, a lot of stuff. And the last important thing, and maybe the most important thing, is not to do illegal things without permission. But well, we are entering now to the Q&A section. Maybe there will be some questions, maybe not. I want to ask you, first of all, before the questions that are going to pop up in the chat, how was this process of checking the security of an airplane, of studying the security of an airplane? It was like something like a research. You did it like just for job. How you started with this?
Yeah, so we got started about 3.5 years ago. one of my colleagues, we were driving past a boneyard for aeroplanes, and we rang them and said, "Hey, can we come play?" They were like, "Okay." um, which is a real surprise. They had some planes that they hadn't taken apart yet. They put power to them and let us play, and we were blown away. It's great. We bought some components from them. We've got all sorts of fun things. In fact, you can probably see behind me, this is part of A320. Over here, I've got some more components too. So yeah, it's a great relationship. We've done it at our own cost, to really try and drive the industry forward. We do now paid work in aviation, so we've been asked to test all sorts of things by operators and airports. But yeah, we were doing this for our own interest and our own fun.
Amazing. Something that is interesting about this is like the technology evolves, and we have a lot of information and software and computers in the aerospace industry. So we have so much to learn about it, and we have so much to learn in aerospace security. So for us, that we are, like we have our differences to United States or or England. So how you feel like this aerospace security industry is evolving, and how and what will be a cool thing to the people that is watching this talk to learn, like in career path, in case they really want to start doing some security audits or some pen testing or some kind of security stuff in our space. So what would be your advice for the people that's watching us and doing?
Yeah, industry has come along a long way in 2 years. You might remember Boeing had a run-in with IOActive 2 years ago now, maybe a bit more, that no one ended up looking good at the end of. But actually, Boeing have come a long way. They've engaged with the aerospace village. They've come to help support the village as well, which is really cool. 2 years ago, RSA, they brought an electronic flight bag with them and demonstrated it. It was super cool. And they've also invited us and other village members to their factories. We've seen a lot of their cybersecurity offerings, which is cool. The industry used to be really closed to external research, but that's changing. Boeing has led the way there. They've been amazingly cool and done a great job of opening up to engage with researchers. I think industry more broadly has a long way to go. We've been very surprised at the very dated response to cybersecurity and research by some, but many others are improving. Ways to get involved is you need to understand the protocols involved. So you need to learn ARINC 49, ARINC 69, and 664. There's a lot of learning to be done there. You don't just pen test a plane. One of the challenges being is you can't predict how some of the unusual protocols and systems will respond. So I'd strongly recommend that anything you do is passive. Do not do anything active on a plane ever. You don't know how the system's going to respond. So be careful.
Okay, Ken. So we are finished our time now. I really want to thank you so much for being here, for this crazy switch of the talks, and trying to make the best of these casualties here. So I really want to thank you. Thank you so much for being here in Patagon Space in Ecopari, and hope in case we have some Q&A, some questions, we are going to forward to you in some way.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, Ken. Thank you so much. See you.